Hey y'all, it's me, it's KDG, and this is the Goldman Hour podcast that will candidly cover current events and other topics in emergency services. If you can survive the Goldman Hour, give or take, of honest and sometimes harsh opinions, stick around and enjoy a fleeting platinum 10 minutes of strict positivity. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and check us out for more at easyemsceu.com/podcast. You push the blade, you lift, you're expecting to see cords, but instead you see nothing. Or just blood, secretions, swelling. Ugh. Everything that shouldn't be there is there. And everything that you need to see isn't. You adjust, reposition, try again. Still nothing. And now the monitor starts to change. SpO2, 94, 89, 84. You can feel the pressure building because this is the moment where your plan stops working. And now you have to decide something. Do you keep going or do you change everything? Welcome back. This is the show where we talk about what EMS actually looks like in the field. Not the perfect airway, not the clean innovation, the real ones. The messy ones, the chaotic ones, the ones where nothing goes according to plan. Today's episode is one of the most important conversations in EMS. Airway nightmares when intubation goes wrong. Because it will go wrong. At some point in your career, you're going to miss. You're going to have a difficult airway. And you're going to have a moment where your plan fails. And what you do next is what defines you as a provider. Let's start with something that doesn't get talked about enough. The problem with airway confidence. Airway has an ego problem in EMS. Intubation is seen as advanced, high level, and a sign that you've made it, quote unquote. And because of that, providers tend to attach identity to it. They want to succeed. They want to get the tube. They want it to go smoothly. And sometimes that creates a very dangerous mindset. See, the problem becomes when intubation becomes about the procedure instead of about the patient. Providers will stop thinking clearly because now you're invested. And when you're invested, you kind of hesitate to change course. You hesitate to admit that something's not working. You hesitate to pivot. And in airway management, hesitation is quite dangerous. Let's stop here because this is where people get into trouble. This is your street truth. A failed intubation doesn't kill patients. An unsecured airway does. Missing a tube? That happens. Every provider, every level. But what matters is what happens next. Because if you keep forcing a plan that's not working, that's when things go bad. Great providers don't chase success. They secure oxygenation, no matter what that looks like. And that's your street truth. So let's build this concept out with a case called the missed first pass. So you have a patient, unresponsive, not protecting their own airway, and you make the decision, we're going to intubate. You position, you prepare, you commit. You go in, you lift, and you miss. So what happens next? In this case, your brain reacts instantly. Fix it. Go again. You can get it. Because that's what you've been trained to do. First pass success matters. But here's the part that people don't think about enough. Second attempts are not the same as first attempts. What changes? After that first attempt, the airway already more irritated. There's more swelling, secretions increase, blood might be present, and our oxygen reserves are much lower. The situation is already worse than it was before you started, and now you're behind the 8 ball, so to speak. The trap is thinking, I just need one more attempt. But every attempt comes with a cost. And if you don't recognize that early, you can start to spiral. So let's simplify this. The goal of airway management is not intubation. It's oxygenation. That's it. Everything else is secondary. Because without oxygenation, nothing else matters. Not the tube, not the placement, not the procedure, just oxygenation. And the moment providers forget that, they lose their ability to adapt. So we need to see a shift in our ALS mindset because when intubation becomes the goal, we tend to force intubation. But when oxygenation is the goal, we tend to adjust and we tend to take on a mindset we're willing to do anything that we need to do to achieve that goal of oxygenation. So you'll step back, you'll reassess, and you'll potentially change your approach, not from that traditional ALS mindset we have to intubate, but to a mindset that's more all level, where we're going to do whatever we have to do to oxygenate this patient and secure that airway. Now, I'm sure that there are going to be some ALS providers out there that's going to be ready to string me up after this next statement, but I'm going to make it anyway because it's true. BLS saves the day. See, this is where EMS gets it wrong sometimes. BLS airway is not a fallback, it's a foundation. What actually saves patients most of the time is airway positioning, like the jaw thrust maneuver, airway adjuncts, two-person BVM ventilation. Guys, these are not basic in the sense that they're less important, but they're fundamental. They're basic in the fact that they're foundational. And when they're done correctly, they can outperform poor ALS airway management every time. The reality of the situation, this airway situation, is a well-managed BVM can maintain oxygenation, buy time, stabilize a patient, and prevent deterioration. But only if it's done well. Because honestly, bad BVM fundamentals is just as dangerous as a failed intubation. Here's your next street truth. A great BLS airway beats a failed ALS airway every time. This job is not about doing the most advanced thing. It's about doing the right thing. And sometimes the right thing is simple. And that's your street truth. The moment of decision. This is where everything tightens. You've made an attempt and it didn't work. And now the patient is starting to decline. Everything feels different. There's less margin for error. And you have some questions. You try again or you change your plan. And this is where mindset really matters because walking away from the tube, unfortunately, in our culture can feel like failure, but it's not. It's clinical awareness. It's decision making. It's recognizing that the situation has suddenly shifted. It's changed. So what do great providers do? They don't double down on failure. They pivot and they do what they have to do to secure that oxygenation. And they stabilize the patient. And then, if appropriate, they reassess their airway situation. Before we go deeper, let's talk about how providers actually get better at this. Because airway is not about memorizing steps, it's about making decisions under pressure. This episode is brought to you by easyemsceu.com. If you want to understand when to intubate, when not to, how to manage difficult airways, and how to think through failure, their courses are built around real-world EMS scenarios. Not perfect ones, real ones. Check them out at easyemsceu.com. So now we've set the stage. We've talked about why intubation fails, why providers struggle to pivot, and why BLS airway matters more than people think. In the next part, we're going to go deeper. We're going to break down true difficult airway scenarios, contamination and airway chaos, and how providers lose control of these situations. Because airway failure doesn't happen all at once, it builds. And if you don't recognize it early, you're already behind. Let's talk about when the airway turns ugly. Up to this point, everything we've talked about assumes something that you can see, that you can identify structures, that the airway is at least somewhat recognizable. That's not always reality. Sometimes the airway turns ugly. So let's discuss another scenario, the contaminated airway. You walk into a scene, the patient is unresponsive again, there's vomit, blood, secretions, and you can hear it before you even touch them. That wet, gurgly sound. The sound of an airway that's already compromised. Now you move fast, you position, and you grab suction, you clear what you can, and you go in, and immediately everything fills back in. Your view disappears, and you suction again. You try to create space. but it's just not staying clear. So what's happening? Obviously, you're not managing a clean airway. You're fighting your environment. And unfortunately, the environment's winning. Let's stop here because this is where things can start to spiral. Here's your street truth. You don't control the airway. You manage it. And sometimes, no matter how good you are, you just don't get a clean view. You don't get ideal conditions and you don't get time. And if you walk into those situations expecting perfection, once again, you're already behind. Great providers don't wait for perfect conditions, they adapt to the bad ones. And that's your street truth. Now we're going to talk about something that doesn't get emphasized enough: suction. Suction is your lifeline. I'm going to go out on a limb and even say we should be setting ourselves up for success from the jump. We should be suctioning prior to almost every intubation. We should just be setting ourselves up for that clear airway. But we are talking about contaminated airways, and the reality is in a contaminated airway, your ability to manage suction is more important than your ability to intubate, because if you can't see, you can't place a tube. So, what do good providers do? They assign suction immediately. They keep it continuous and they stay ahead of contamination. They don't treat suction like an accessory, they treat it like a primary airway tool. So, what tends to go wrong? What tends to happen is providers tend to underestimate the volume in the airway, they stop suctioning too early, or they try to rush their tube. Unfortunately, that's how you lose your airway. Now, typically, you don't think about losing control of the airway as losing control of the scene, but let's zoom out because airway failure isn't just a skill issue, it's a control issue. So, what does it look like? The airway's difficult and you're struggling. People start talking more. Movement everywhere gets a little bit faster. Communication breaks down. Focus shifts. Maybe you get excited. Maybe your voice gets high. Maybe you're talking faster. And suddenly, the entire scene feels chaotic. So, why does this happen? It happens because everybody recognizes that the airway is high stakes. And when things don't go as planned, everyone feels it. But here's the problem: if you let that chaos take over, you lose your ability to think. You can't no longer fall back on your skills. It's not going to be a simple innovation. You're going to have to use your critical thinking skills. And again, in that chaos, you might lose that. Here's your next street truth. Bad airway management is rarely a skill failure. It's a system failure. It's not just about the person holding onto the laryngoscope. It's about communication, roles, preparation, and scene control. Because when all of those things break down, even a skilled provider will struggle. That's your street truth. But let's go back into the airway. You've already missed once. Now you're thinking, I just need one more shot. And you might fall into the second attempt trap. The problem is that second attempt feels like the solution, but in reality, it's often the tipping point because now oxygen reserves are lower, the airway's more irritated, and your margin for error is much smaller. And if that second attempt fails, you're in a much worse position. So what do the great providers do? They do not rush into attempt number 2. They pause, they oxygenate, they reassess, and they ask, am I still on the right path? Is this still the right plan? Recognizing when things are not working, recognizing failure early is one of the most important skills in airway management. Let's think about some signs that you're losing the airway. These can include poor visualization, increasing contamination, dropping oxygen saturations, or rising stress levels even. The mistake is waiting too long to change your course, because once that patient crashes, your options begin to shrink. And here's again where we need to see a shift in our ALS thinking. Great providers don't wait for failure. They recognize it early and they adjust before it becomes a critical situation. Here's a street truth that defines strong airway providers. You don't get points for sticking with a bad plan. There's no reward for forcing an intubation that's not working. There's no recognition for failed attempts. The only thing that matters is the patient. And the patient needs oxygen, not persistence. That's your street truth. This next concept is one of the hardest things to do under pressure. Simply stepping back. So why is that so hard? Well, it's hard because it feels like you're losing time and it feels like you're giving up control. But in reality, you're actually regaining it. Stepping back allows oxygenation to improve, it reduces stress, and it gives you space to think. And thinking, guys, is what's going to get you out of bad situations. Before we go further, let's talk about how providers actually get good at managing these situations. Because this level of thinking doesn't come from repetition alone, it comes from understanding. This episode is brought to you by easyemsceu.com. If you want to learn how to manage difficult airways, how to recognize failure early, and how to make better decisions under pressure, their training focuses on real-world EMS scenarios. Not perfect ones, not ideal ones, the ones that actually challenge you. Check them out at easyemsceu.com. Every airway needs a backup plan. Actually, multiple backup plans. Some of our options may include BVM ventilations, supraglottic airways, repositioning our patient, or even delaying intubation. The key here is you don't come up with the backup plan after the failure. You have to have it before you start, because once things go bad, you don't have time to think from scratch. There's a moment in every bad airway, a turning point, if you will, where things will either stabilize or they will start to spiral out of control. And that moment comes down to one decision. Do you adapt or do you try to force it? So now we've talked about contaminated airways, loss of control, failed attempts, and recognizing when things are going wrong. In this next part, we're going deeper into advanced airway decision making, how great providers recover, and how to lead these situations under pressure. Because the airway isn't won in perfect conditions, it's won in recovery. Up to this point, we've talked about how airways go wrong. Now let's talk about what actually matters: recovery. Recovery is the skill, because here's the reality. You're going to have a bad airway. It's not a possibility. It's a guarantee. And when that happens, your value as a provider is not determined by whether you get the tube. It's determined by how you respond when you don't. Again, we have to have a shift. Average providers tend to focus on success. Great providers focus on recovery, because success is not always under your control, but recovery is. Let's go back to a moment we've already talked about. You've attempted, you've missed, and the airway is getting worse. This is where everything slows down, or it should. What great providers do is they reset, not mentally, not emotionally, but physically. They stopped their attempt. They reestablished oxygenation by any means necessary. They may reposition the patient, may clear the airway again. But regardless of what they do, they don't rush into their next move. They create space. And this matters because every second you spend forcing a failing plan is a second that your patient's deteriorating. But every second that you spend restoring oxygenation is a second where you're stabilizing the situation. Here's your next street truth. You can't fix a bad airway if you don't stop making it worse. That's what repeated failed attempts do. They don't improve the situation, they degrade it. They increase swelling, it increases contamination, and it decreases oxygen reserves. And eventually, you run out of options. Great providers recognize when they're contributing to the problem, and they stop. That's your street truth. Let's bring this back again to fundamentals. Oxygenation is everything because oxygenation buys you time, and time is what you need to slow everything down and to think. So, with what happens without oxygenation? In a roundabout way, decision making becomes rushed. Everything has to happen right now. Stress increases exponentially and mistakes compound. But with oxygenation, you have time. You can reassess. You can change strategy. You can recover. The key principle here is you don't win airways by getting the tube fast. You win the airway game by maintaining oxygenation long enough to make the right decision. Now we must talk about the alternative airway because this is where providers either evolve or they stay stuck because this is where you have to let go of something, literally, the tube. The reality is not every patient needs an endotracheal tube. Some patients need a supraglottic airway. Some patients need an effective BVM. Some patients just need to be positioned properly, and that's enough. But the problem here is cultural. Some providers see these options as, quote, less than, as a fallback, as failure. But they're not. They're solutions. And guys, sometimes they're the best solution. Here's a street truth that changes how you think about airway forever. There is no advanced airway if the patient isn't oxygenated. It doesn't matter how perfect your tube is. If the patient is hypoxic, you failed. But if your patient is oxygenated, you're succeeding. No matter what method you used, you're succeeding. And that's your street truth. Name one of the hardest skills in EMS. Did you guess slowing down? Slowing down under pressure when everything feels urgent? I bet you didn't. When things go bad, your instinct is to move faster. But that speed is an illusion. Faster does not equal better. In fact, it usually makes things worse. So what do great providers do? They control their pace. They slow their movements. They communicate. They speak clearly. They create structure, regardless of the chaos around them. Here's another street truth. Speed feels productive, but control is what actually saves patients. You can move fast and make bad decisions, or you can slow down and make the right one. Great providers choose control. That's your street truth. Airway is not just about what's happening right now. It's about what's about to happen next. So what do great providers do? They think ahead. It's like playing chess. You always have to be thinking of moves ahead. So great providers ask themselves, if this fails, what next? If this gets worse, what's my plan? If I lose this airway, what's my backup? They don't wait for failure. They prepare for it. The difference is average providers tend to react. Great providers anticipate. So let's talk about the moment that you take control back. There's a moment in every airway where it either continues to spiral or stabilizes. And that moment comes down to one thing: control. And what does that look like? You stop rushing, you reestablish oxygenation, you organize the scene, you make a clear decision. And suddenly, everything changes. Because now you're not reacting anymore. Now you're leading. Here's a street truth that defines strong providers. You don't rise to the pressure of the call. You fall to the level of your control. If you lose control, that call now controls you. If you maintain control, you control the outcome. That's your street truth. Every airway teaches you something. Some teach you skill, some will teach you humility, and some teach you what not to do. The important part is that you learn and you reflect and you change how you approach the next one and the one after that. Because that's how providers grow. Not from perfect calls, but from difficult ones. And how you react to those calls and what you learn from them is going to define the provider that you're going to become. So now we've talked about failure and recovery and control and decision making. Now we finish this because in this next part is where everything comes together. We're going to talk about mastery, long-term airway mindset, and the final principle that defines great providers. Because at the end of the day, again, airway is not about perfection. It's about thinking. Let's talk about mastery. Because in EMS, this word gets thrown around a lot. People think mastery looks like perfect first pass innovations and clean airways, smooth textbook scenarios. And yes, occasionally those things happen. That's not mastery. Real mastery is what happens when things go wrong, when the airway's contaminated, when the patient's crashing, and when nothing looks the way it should. That's where mastery shows up, not in perfection, but in control. So, what does that control look like? It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's quiet. It's the provider who stops when things aren't working, reestablishes oxygenation, changes plans without hesitation, and keeps the scene structured. It's not about forcing success. It's about managing failure. Let's talk about playing the long game of airway. Here's something that takes time to understand. Airway is not about one call. It's about how you approach every call. Early in your career, you want the tube, the success, the skill. You want to prove that you can do it. But later, as you grow and develop, you realize something. The providers who are truly strong in airway are not the ones who always intubate. They're the ones who always manage oxygenation because that's what matters. And suddenly you'll have a shift. You stop chasing procedures and you start focusing on outcomes. Let's go back to that moment that we've become quite familiar with. The airway's difficult, the plan isn't working, and the patient's declining. This is where everything either speeds up or slows down. Great providers slow it down. They pause. They reassess and they reestablish control. They don't rush into the next move, but they make the right move because that's the difference. This is your final street truth, and this one defines everything we talked about today. Airway is not about intubation. It's about oxygenation. Not the tube, not the view, not the procedure. Oxygenation. Because if your patient is oxygenated, you're winning. And if they're not, nothing else matters. That's your street truth. So, what does this episode mean for you? If you've been listening to this and thinking, I've forced that before, good. Everyone has. This episode isn't about perfection. It never is. It's about awareness. Because once you see this, you can't unsee it. So, what changes now? You slow down. You recognize failure earlier. Stop forcing bad habits and focus on oxygenation. And over time, that changes everything. What kind of provider do you want to become? Every airway shapes you. Some teach you confidence, and some teach you humility. Some teach you restraint, and the best providers learn from all of them. The goal is not to avoid difficult airways. It's to handle them well, because they're coming. And when they do, you'll be ready. This job is not about looking good. It's not about advanced procedures. It's not about getting the tube. It's about patients, and patients need oxygen. That's it. That's the job. Next time you're in a difficult airway and your first plan doesn't work, remember this. You don't need the perfect airway. You need an effective one. This is your show. Real EMS, real decisions, real growth. Stay sharp, stay controlled. I'll see you next episode. Before we go, let's talk about something every provider thinks they understand. Cardiac arrest. We train it, we drill it, we run it over and over again. But here's the question nobody asks enough: what actually works? Because in 2026, we've got more tools than ever: mechanical CPR, advanced medications, new protocols, better data, and yet outcomes haven't improved the way you'd expect. So, what's missing? Next episode, we're breaking it down. In cardiac arrest in 2026, what actually works? We're talking about pit crew CPR and why it matters. The real debate around epinephrine, when mechanical CPR helps and when it doesn't, and the small details that actually change outcomes. Because cardiac arrest isn't about doing more, it's about doing the right things at the right time without wasting a second. If you think you know cardiac arrest, this episode might change your mind. I'll see you next episode. Every once in a while, we take 10 minutes to recognize something that represents the very best of this profession. Not just individuals, not just single moments, but something bigger, something that moves the entire field forward. This week's Platinum 10 Minutes isn't about one person. It's about a gathering, a mindset, a standard. It's about what just happened in FDIC International in Indianapolis. Because for those of you who've been, you already understand. And for those who haven't, let's talk about why it matters. First off, it's more than a conference. From the outside, it definitely looks like a conference. Booths and classes and vendors and crowds, thousands of people walking through convention halls. That's not what it is, not really. Because what FDIC represents is something deeper. It's a gathering of people who choose not to stay comfortable, people who choose not to settle, people who looked at their profession and said, I want to be better. Think about who attends FDIC. Yes, firefighters and paramedics and EMTs, instructors, leaders, students. That's true. People from all over the country and beyond. And none of them are required to be there. That's the part that matters. They choose to be there. They take time away from home and their family and from their normal routines to learn and to grow and to improve. And that decision alone says something about who they are. They have a mindset of improvement because in emergency services, it's really easy to fall into a routine. You work your shifts, you run your calls, you get comfortable, and you start to believe, I know enough. But the people at FDIC, they reject that idea. They understand something fundamental. This job is constantly evolving, and if you're not evolving with it, you're falling behind. FDIC fosters the opportunity to pursue excellence. FDIC is not about checking a box. It's not about saying, I attended. It's about the pursuit of excellence. Because every class, every hands-on session, every conversation in a hallway is an opportunity to improve, to refine your thinking, to sharpen your skills, to challenge your assumptions. And that's what separates good providers from great ones. There's also a certain energy at FDIC. You feel it the moment that you walk in. It's in the conversations, it's in the way that people engage, it's in the questions that are being asked, not surface level questions, but real questions. The kind that come from experience, from struggle, from wanting to do better. And that energy has a tendency to spread. Because when you surround yourself with people who are committed to growth, you start to elevate your own expectations. One of the most powerful parts of FDIC doesn't happen in the classroom. It's learning beyond the classroom. It happens in conversations, between sessions, and in hallways and over meals. It's where people share stories, real stories about calls that challenged them or mistakes that they learned from or decisions that stayed with them. And those conversations, they carry just as much value as any lecture because they're real and they're honest. And they remind you of something important. Everyone is still learning. Let's not overlook something. Showing up to something like FDIC takes effort. It takes planning, it takes sacrifice, it takes commitment, and not just financial commitment, personal commitment, because you're choosing to invest in yourself. You're choosing to say, I'm not done growing, and that matters. Because the providers who continue to invest in themselves are the ones who make the biggest difference in the field. Events like FDIC don't just educate individuals, they raise the standard of our entire profession because every person who attends takes something back with them: new knowledge, new perspective, new ideas, and they bring that back to their department, their partners, their community, and slowly that spreads. That is how professions evolve, not through mandates, not through force, but through people who choose to get better. But there's another side to this, because once you gain that knowledge, once you've seen what's possible, you have a new responsibility. You now carry a responsibility to apply it, to share it, to elevate those around you, because knowledge that isn't used doesn't help anyone. And the people who attended FDIC, they're now in a position to influence others, to mentor, to teach, to lead. And that's how real change happens. There's something else that stands out about FDIC: respect. Respect for the craft, because that's what this is. Emergency services is a craft. It requires skill and practice and attention to detail. And the people who show up to learn, to train, to improve, they respect that. They don't take it lightly. They understand that what they do matters, that the decisions that they make matter, and that the difference between average and excellent can change outcomes. One of the most dangerous mindsets in this job is thinking, I've arrived, that you've learned enough. Because the moment that you stop learning, you stop improving. And the people at FDIC, they reject that completely. They embrace something better: continuous growth, continuous learning, and continuous improvement. What happened in Indianapolis at FDIC was bigger than a conference. It was a reminder. It was a reminder of what this profession can be when people care, when people invest in themselves, when people push for excellence. Because at the end of the day, this job is about people and about our patients, and better providers create better outcomes. So, to everyone who attended FDIC this year, this is for you. Your effort matters. Your commitment matters. The time you spent learning will show up in the field, in the way you assess patients, in the way you make decisions, and in the way that you lead. And those improvements, they don't just affect you, they affect everyone you work with and every patient that you care for. And if you didn't attend this year, that's okay. I wasn't able to either. But the mindset still applies, because growth doesn't only happen at conferences, it happens anywhere that you choose to invest in yourself. The key is the decision to not be stagnant, the decision to keep learning, and the decision to get better. This brings us to another critical concept: continuing education. Because one event, no matter how big or how powerful, is not enough. Growth is not a one-time experience. It's ongoing, and it's consistent, and it's intentional. And the providers who sustain excellence are the ones who make learning a habit, not an event. What FDIC represents is what this profession should always be moving toward: better training, better thinking, and better care. And that doesn't end when the event is over. That continues every day, every shift, and every call. If you're someone who believes in that mindset, if you're someone who wants to keep improving, then you need a way to continue that momentum. That's why we built easyemsceu.com, because not everyone can make it to events like FDIC every year. But that doesn't mean you stop learning. It doesn't mean you stop growing. It doesn't mean you settle. easyemsceu.com is designed for providers who want real-world education, practical decision-making, and training that actually translates to the field. Because this job deserves more than memorization. It deserves understanding. And the patients we serve, they deserve providers who never stop getting better. This week's Platinum 10 Minutes goes to everyone who showed up, who invested in themselves, who choose growth over comfort, who pushed the profession forward. Because that's what excellence looks like, and that's what this job needs more of. This has been the Platinum 10 Minutes. Well, folks, I'm 10-8 for now. Thanks for joining me on the Goldman Hour and for the Platinum 10 Minutes. Please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. And check out all our cool extras at easyemsceu.com/podcast and become a member of G Shift. Don't hesitate to reach out. I love hearing from my listeners, and if you send me an article or topic I use on my podcast, you'll for sure get a shout out. Until we're all 1041 together again, y'all stay safe out there.